But I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Drupal as it relates to front-end development, and specifically with JavaScript. As I said, Sally introduced me already, but I started Drupal 18 years ago, a long time ago. Started it out of my dorm room in Antwerp, Belgium. I assume I should be talking in English. Is that right? Yeah, there's a lot of non-Dutch people in the room. And then about 10.5 years ago, I started a company called Acquia, and we help typically large organizations with their Drupal sites. As I said, I'm not a front-end developer, so please take it easy on me. What I want to talk about today is 4 different things. I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of JavaScript, because I think it's really fascinating. I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of Drupal. And then from there, I want to talk about what we're doing to make Drupal API first, something that we've been investing in for a long time. And then also, lastly, I want to talk about what we're doing to introduce more JavaScript into Drupal, specifically to create a better administration UI in the Drupal project. So let's start with a little bit of history about JavaScript. So how many of you knew that JavaScript was created in just 10 days? All right, some people do. And so it was actually created in May 1995 by Brendan Ike, I think it's pronounced. He was working at Netscape at the time. And so he did create it in just 10 days. And really for the first 10 years, almost no professional developers took JavaScript serious. And I remember this because in the early days of Drupal, we really tried hard to keep JavaScript out of the project. We had a lot of rules around this, actually. And so obviously, that's been relaxed. Fast forward, and I would say in 2004, something pretty cool happened. And I also remember this. And Google launched Gmail, or relaunched Gmail, I should say, with sort of a completely different UI, right? And so they started using JavaScript to make Gmail better. And it was kind of a big deal because a lot of us were using things like Hotmail and some of these other providers, and they worked completely differently. They weren't as cool, as slick. And so really, they kind of caught the attention of a lot of people, right? And so what they did to make Gmail a lot more interactive, or create a better experience with Gmail, is that they started to use the XML HTTP request functionality, if you will, right? And it really allowed them to load data sort of asynchronously in the background. And so that way the application, Gmail itself, didn't have to do page refreshes. And it was eye-opening. It was really kind of revolutionary, especially, and I'm not sure if you remember that, but they combined it with, and we'll give you, I think it was like 2 gigabytes of space, whereas the other providers are like, here's 50 megabytes. Right, and so they really kind of changed the game. As I said, it really caught the attention of a lot of developers around the world. People started talking about it. It was kind of exciting. Then in 2005, they did the same with Google Maps. And again, if you think about the competitors at the time, these map applications weren't that good, right? And so when Google launched Google Maps, it worked completely different. It was really refreshing. It was really cool to see how they kind of reimagined online maps using the XML HTTP request. And so from these 2 big events, and a lot of smaller things happening as well, obviously, we sort of saw we created sort of this Ajax movement. It was later called Ajax, right? And so it was a combination of techniques and tools to make these kinds of more interactive application. And in my mind, and this is just from my point of view, this was sort of the start of what I would say sort of a JavaScript renaissance, right? People started building more interactive applications, and we saw the development of frameworks like Prototype and jQuery and Dojo and MooTools. You guys remember those? Yeah? These were fun days. And Drupal actually was one of the first, if not the first, large open source project to sort of embrace jQuery. And we added jQuery to core before any other large project, and it really helped to put jQuery on the map. Like the fact that Drupal put it in core kind of made them all of a sudden much more relevant. And so that's pretty exciting. 2008, Google launched Chrome with a faster JavaScript runtime called V8. And in their press release, they had this little sentence, which at the time, I don't know, I'm sure I read it, but I didn't think much of it. But if you think about it now, you know, what they wrote is, we also built a more powerful JavaScript engine to power the next generation of web applications that aren't even possible in today's browsers. If you think about it now, 10 years later, it was kind of a revolutionary statement, and it became true, right? And so I think that's pretty cool. It caught my attention. I wasn't going to talk about this, but at the time I was writing my PhD dissertation, actually. And my PhD had nothing to do with PHP or Drupal, but it had everything to do with virtual machines and runtimes. And so I spent my good chunk of my own professional career on building runtime compilers for the Java language, not for JavaScript, but for the Java language. And so this was very interesting to me because it was directly related to my own research. And so I remember this very vividly because I was writing, sort of my dissertation, and all of a sudden, Google launched something that was kind of related to what I was doing. And so I was very intrigued. But yeah, they actually used a lot of common techniques that existed in Java and other runtime environments to make JavaScript fast, right? So they would compile it to native machine code. And that was a big deal. 2010, Twitter, they made sort of a interesting move. And what they decided to do is really re-architect their application, Twitter, to be more of an API server. And they said all of the different clients, whether it's a website, whether it's a mobile application, whether it's some other desktop tool, they're all going to talk to a single API server, right? And then they used JavaScript to build the twitter.com user experience. So very much a decoupled application. And so the way this worked is like a decoupled application. And so there was a JavaScript client fetching data from that API server and then rendering that data to provide the experience. Unfortunately, Twitter was growing so fast that they had a lot of performance issues. So I'm not sure if you remember this, but the famous Twitter fail whale, you saw that quite a bit. And it wasn't just that they were scaling or growing that fast, but also the way they implemented it was not ideal, right? Because the way they architected it is the whole JavaScript application had to be downloaded, parsed, interpreted, and executed on every time people were using Twitter. And so the time to first interaction was very poor. And so Twitter actually suffered from these performance issues for quite a long time. Like they did something very cool and innovative, but it wasn't quite working at Twitter scale, I should say. And so in 2012, 2 years later, they kind of reversed the course. And they said, you know what, we're not going to do all of the rendering on the client side. We're going to bring a lot of it back to the server side, which, could have been perceived as a setback, I guess, for some of the JavaScript community. And so, they brought a lot of the rendering back. And so now the architecture was that the server side would do sort of an initial page render, would send that initial render to the client, and then on the client, they would bootstrap a much smaller JavaScript application, a lot less code, that sort of overlaid, I guess, the interactive part on top of the pre-rendered part, right? And so it's a model that obviously today is quite common. But in this case, the browser, as I said, runs a much smaller application, and so also needed to download less code, which was faster, and needed to parse less code and execute less code. And so this actually turned out to be a huge win. Huge win because it reduced the page load time by about 80%, which is a big deal, 80%. And so that really kind of established a new pattern coming from a very large or well-known organization. And in 2013, Airbnb was actually the first large organization to use Node.js. They used Node.js to do isomorphic JavaScript, shared JavaScript on the server and on the client. And that was a huge advantage because it was a lot less prone to errors because it would use kind of the same reusable rendering system on both the server and the client. So that's not that long ago, if you think about it, that some of these patterns were introduced. Fast forward to today, and the JavaScript world obviously has continued to mature quite a bit. If you think about what we do in Drupal, we use Babel as our transpiler, as an example, so we can actually write modern JavaScript in Drupal core. We've also recently, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, we also recently started using Nightwatch to do JavaScript testing, which is really cool. And so really, fast forward, what started as something really small that was written in 10 days has evolved into something, quite powerful that's, no longer considered for amateurs, that actually scales, and there's a lot of tooling around this language. So pretty cool. Now, a little bit about Drupal's history, right? Because along this JavaScript timeline, Drupal coexisted with JavaScript for a long time. And so, as I mentioned, I started Drupal 18 years ago. You've probably all seen this photo, but this is me in my dorm 18 years ago. It's a dorm where I started Drupal. And I think most of you know the story, but I didn't have any master plans or big ideas. I just wanted to have some fun, dabble with technology. I promised some of my friends that I could build a message board in a couple of nights. And I figured I would use MySQL and PHP because these were kind of new technologies. And so I did. And that quickly evolved into, kind of spiraled out of control, one could say, evolved into something much bigger. But at the time when I started Drupal, HTML4 was all the rage. And CSS was sort of really new. I remember talking a lot about how we could move styling to CSS. And I was like, we didn't call it an initiative, but it was something that we were working on. As I said, JavaScript was for amateurs. Like, people didn't like it. And we went out of our way to avoid it. I don't know if you realize this or if you can put this into context, but Google was just launched, right? Google wasn't that old. At the time when I started Drupal, mobile web didn't exist. We had these flip phones. I had one because I went to my dorm and my parents insisted that I had a phone because in my dorm I had no phone, no TV, nothing, right? And so my parents were like, oh, we need to be able to reach them somehow. And so they bought me this flip phone, which at the time you had to be ashamed of it. Like I would hide my phone from my friends because, people thought it was not something that normal students have. But anyway, we had flip phones. AT&T, which I think you know, but it's sort of the largest telco in the US, had just launched text messaging. And this is like old school text messaging, right? Like not the new iMessage kind of stuff. So, text messaging was just launched. So, there's like literally no mobile web. Social media at the time didn't exist. When I released the first version of Drupal, if you read the release announcement, I said something like, and it includes a feature for public diaries. And so blogging actually didn't exist, right? People were still calling it something other than blogging. Eventually, these things became blogging. And And so the world looked quite differently, and so Drupal has evolved through, I would say, multiple eras of innovation and change. And yet we've been able to constantly evolve and reinvent ourselves, which is really quite remarkable. I don't think there's that many open source PHP-based technologies that have been around for 18 years and are still doing really, really well. I'm not sure how many of you actually, I know Frontend United started as a Drupal conference, at least that's my understanding, but it's kind of evolved to be more about front-end technologies. But we are one of the largest open source projects in the world, obviously, especially when measured in terms of how many people contribute to Drupal. Like we have thousands of people contributing to Drupal. We power hundreds of thousands of websites around the world. Drupal is still very relevant. And so what I want to talk about next is sort of how are we going to stay relevant, right? We've done a great job staying relevant. And so what else are we going to do to get to keep evolving and to stay relevant so that 10 years from today, we can look back and say, wow, did you know what? All of these things didn't exist at the time, but now they do, and we adjusted ourselves to it. I think a lot of that reinvention we did in Drupal 8, which was released a couple of years ago. It's a big change, and I'm sure a lot of you have suffered through or may still be suffering through a lot of these changes. Really, we updated the architecture to be much more modern. We made big changes to overcome a variety of big pain points. And adoption has been slow because of the size of the change and the impact on the ecosystem. We have like 20,000 contributed modules or something, and all of these need to be refactored, right? And so that took a while, because you have to imagine, every time we release a new version of Drupal, we somehow have to retrain maybe 500,000 developers in the world on this new architecture. I mean, it's not a small thing to do. And then we have to update all of these modules, and it's sort of this huge effort to do that. Fortunately, things are really starting to pick up. If you look at the year-over-year increase in Drupal 8 side, we see that things are really starting to take off. We saw a 51% increase. We saw an even faster acceleration of the readiness of contributed modules. So compared to a year ago, we have 80% more stable contributed modules. So lots of great things are happening. Now, if I look back at Drupal 8 and all of the things we've been doing, there's a lot of great things in there. Don't get me wrong, but if I had to boil it down to two things, I would say we spend a lot of time improving the authoring experience and the site building experience with things like in-place editing and all that kind of stuff. We added a WYSIWYG editing capability to Drupal, all of these things. But the second piece is that we really invested in starting to evolve Drupal into an API-first platform, right? We had dedicated people on this for many, many years. We decided to add the web services APIs to Drupal core. And so that ended up in Drupal 8. We released Drupal 8. And ever since, the past two something years, we have continued to work on making Drupal API first. A lot of effort has gone into that since. I want to talk a little bit about that. So I already said this. 7 years ago, we started this. And I would say that today, the support for Drupal's REST API is actually pretty rich and pretty mature. Now, that doesn't mean we're done. There's a lot of work left to be done. But what we've done is we've added REST support to all of the entity types. So whether it's blog posts or articles or users or comments, all of these things can be accessed now through a REST API. Configuration entity support as well, right? Sort of complex configuration can be accessed as well. And then we've also added support for basic functionality like user logins and logouts and registration, all these kinds of things. Most recently, we made some improvements around file handling through the REST API, which will go into 8.6, which is a great example of a recent improvement. Along the way, we've also been working on JSON API and GraphQL as contributed modules. A lot of people actually are using these things. We're targeting to add JSON API to core. I'm crossing my fingers this will happen in 8.6, our next release. We're still working through some issues there. But a lot of work has gone into these things. I'm personally pretty excited about JSON API and GraphQL because it provides, depends a little bit on the use case, but it often provides a much better user experience, right? If you think about one of the core strengths of Drupal is sort of our content modeling tools. The fact that we have entities and we can reference entities and we can build these kind of entity graphs, if you want to call it that way. And so with the REST API, it's a little bit cumbersome to get all of that data. You have to do multiple requests, to get the whole graph. And so JSON API and GraphQL allow you to access that data more easily, I would say, and often in a single query, right? So the developer experience is a lot better, and sometimes that translates to to better performance of the application itself too. So hopefully we'll get JSON API in 8.6, and then hopefully we'll get GraphQL in core at some point as well. But we're focused on JSON API right now. And so really what's been happening is that Drupal has sort of been evolving into a content repository or a content service that people and organizations have been using for building decoupled applications. And I think it's really valuable for people to start thinking about Drupal that way a little bit more, right? And we should help maybe JavaScript developers understand that when they're building an application and they have to use a bunch of data, yeah, use MongoDB as your data store. But if you have a content-rich application, and maybe you have to manage certain workflows around that content, or maybe you have to deal with translations, internationalization. This is where Drupal becomes really powerful as a content backend or a content service. And so I think we're making good progress there. As I said, more and more organizations are starting to build these kinds of applications. We don't have really good data about it, but I have anecdotal data that, I would say probably 20% of the new sites that are being built might be a little bit too high. But a good amount of new sites that are being built appear to be decoupled. A couple of examples here. I'm sure some of these brands are well known to you. The Weather Channel is an amazing example. Actually, I believe it's a top 10 or top 20 website in the world. So they do, billions of page views because everybody checks the weather around the world. And a lot of the apps on your phones actually, they're kind of use weather, weather.com as a backend for the apps as well. So they actually really get a lot of traffic that way. Princess Cruises is an interesting example. It's at the third one from the top. But they have this, I don't know if you know Princess Cruises, but they have these multi-billion-dollar cruise ships. And they're doing pretty interesting things with Drupal. They really are trying to create a sort of a customer experience that starts with the website, like how you buy a cruise and what features you want to select. You can book massages and dinners through the website. But then they really carry that experience into the cruise ship. And so if you enter the cruise ship, there's these digital screens, and in your room there is an iPad or some sort of tablet. And it's all using Drupal that's powering these things. It's all using decoupled, right? And so when you're in your room, they already know you, and you can see the things that you booked, and it's pretty interesting. I've actually talked to them, and one of the more difficult challenges that they have, this is an aside, by the way, is when they're, say, crossing the Atlantic Ocean or what have you, they often lose internet connection, right? So they actually have racks of servers on the cruise ship on which Drupal runs. And then when they regain internet connection, like a whole bunch of things have changed, obviously, in the Drupal site, and they have to like sync it back with the servers on shore, I guess. And so it makes for a really interesting challenge. Another great example is Vodafone. I don't think it's on the slide, but Vodafone in the UK, they have all these stores. And so they have decoupled Drupal. And so in all of the stores at these TVs, I guess, where they would show information. And every day, the store manager would take a USB stick, go to his or her computer, download the latest presentation, and load it up on the TV and play that, right? And so they switched to Drupal, and now Drupal is actually pushing that content directly to the TVs. No more USB sticks required, but it's a great example because it's not a website, but it is a sort of something that's now possible thanks to the fact that Drupal has these web services API. So I'll give you one more example, which is the MTA, which is the, it's basically the New York metro system. And so they use Drupal, and Drupal actually powers a lot of the screens in the metro station. I'm not sure if you knew that, but so when the screens that say the next train is coming in 5 minutes, right? So all of that data goes into Drupal, and then Drupal pushes it out to these screens. So lots of great things that are happening and have been happening for a while. I have one more example, which is New Balance. And so it's really helping companies like New Balance to, what I call ambitious digital experiences, right? It's allowing them to build these. They use headless Drupal as well. They use Drupal as a content repository to power their website, but also their application. And here you can see you can sort of personalize the experience. You can select what you're interested in. And then they'll serve you kind of news related to your interest. So I don't know. I think it's really interesting to see the kinds of innovations that we're starting to see. And it's definitely different from what we saw maybe 5 years ago, what people did with Drupal. So that's one thing. All right, then more recently, I should say, we started working on a JavaScript-driven Drupal admin UI, right? And so while it's great that people start building these decoupled applications on top of Drupal for their customers, Drupal itself could also provide a better experience to Drupal's customers, which are the content creators and the site builders. And so Drupal really needs to get better at this. I talked a little bit about this in my DrupalCon keynote in Nashville, but we did a fairly large survey talking to hundreds of different stakeholders. And one of the things that we heard the most is that Drupal's own admin UI was not easy to use, right? And so we have all this great technology that other people are using to build great experiences on top of Drupal, so why wouldn't we use that technology? Is my voice changing? That means you have to pay extra attention. Maybe I should not walk around. And so we got together in DrupalCon Vienna, which I forgot how long ago that is. I'm going to say 7 months ago, right? Half a year ago. And in Vienna, we basically decided that we were going to start working on an alternative Drupal administrative UI. And we also decided that we wanted to use React for that, right? So we went through an exercise where we looked at a whole bunch of different technologies that we can use, and it's really hard to pick one because so many people have different opinions about which technology to use, but we looked at things like the maturity of the ecosystem, how they do releases, and if it's compatible sort of with our release cadence. We looked at licenses as well. So we looked at a lot of different things, honestly, and we ended up choosing React to build our new administrative UI. And so we've been doing some prototyping. Team of people have been working on this and have started sort of trying to build something to really learn what it takes to build this, right? And so we've learned a bunch of things, and out of that, we have sort of identified 6 steps of 6 things we have to do, chunks of work, I should say, of things that we need to do to make progress on this. And the first, I want to walk you through all 6 real quick. So the first one is to stabilize the JSON API module, right? So I said already that we're targeting Drupal 8.6. We really would love to build this on top of JSON because it's easier, it's widely used specification, and so we want to finish that and get it into 8.6. Because we are going to have a lot more JavaScript in core, we also need to improve our JavaScript testing infrastructure. And so Drupal has excellent testing for PHP. I know a lot of people are often frustrated with testing, but if you really compare what we do in Drupal with a lot of other organizations, what we do for PHP testing is phenomenal. Yes, it can be better, but it is really good, right? And so it's good that we do that for PHP, but it's not good enough for JavaScript, right? So for JavaScript, we embraced Nightwatch, as I said, because it's a testing framework written in Java, so Java developers can actually write tests in Java. So it's in Java, in JavaScript for JavaScript developers, and so we committed that to 8.6. So it's scheduled to be released as part of 8.6. We have a couple of loose ends to clean up there, so we want to finalize that as well. Feel pretty good about us being able to finish that work. A third piece is to really actually create a new experience, I should say, for the UI. I mean, we can bring all of this great technology, but it really allows us to reimagine how the Drupal administration UI could work. And that's a lot of work. It's probably the biggest chunk of work, I would say, from figuring out how Drupal should work, testing that, validating that, designing that, because it's not just the experience, but we also have to make it look pretty. And so we started to do some work on this. Roy and Christina, they're both here. They're kind of leading this effort to reimagine how Drupal's administration UI could look and work, I should say. I would say it's an area where we could use a lot of help, whether it's more people or funding for these people that are doing the work. So if you're interested in helping with this, we would love your help. But we need to start that work now, because if we don't, it's going to block us a few months down the road, I would say. The fourth thing we're trying to figure out is how do we combine React and Twig, right? So that's important, because what we don't want to do is sort of do this big bang release of a React-based UI. And so we want to give developers time to an optionality to some extent. If you don't need React, maybe you can keep using Twig. But also, once we introduce React, it's fine if you use Twig and then you move your code eventually to React, right? And so we need to figure out a way to make these two coexist and make them coexist gracefully too, so that from an end user point of view, from a content author or administrator, it doesn't feel weird, that it's sort of smooth integration. And so the team is really trying to figure out how we can accomplish that. Fifth, I would say we need to implement missing web service APIs. Like the prototype, and Sally did a great blog post about it actually on the Lullabot website. I would go check it out because it has screenshots that my presentation doesn't have. But if you look at the screenshots, one of the things that's in Sally's post is this prototype that I talked about. And one of the pieces that they prototyped was the, I think it was a permissions page, admin/user/permission, I think it is. And when they were building this, they discovered that there is no web service API to actually retrieve the list of all the permissions for all the roles. And so there is no API, and so they had to build a quick API, and they put it in a contributed module so they could keep making progress. But obviously what we want to do is we want to put those APIs in core itself, right? And so as we're going to rebuild pieces of the admin API, admin UI in React, we're going to uncover a lot of these things. I think these are great ways for people to get involved. You can try and get ahead of that, figure out where we're missing good APIs, and try implementing them. I imagine some of them are reasonably easy to do, and others are probably a lot more complex, but it might be a great way to get involved if you're a backend developer and you want to contribute to this initiative. I think there's an issue with a list of all of the things. You can also probably look at the module, contributed module that they have, where they kind of temporarily put these APIs. All right, and then the last one is like figuring out how we make the React UI extensible and configurable. And there was actually a sprint this week here for 4 days, I would say, where they've really kind of focused on this, I would say, right? Because the power of Drupal is the flexibility. Like people can download modules, install modules, and they get incorporated in the UI. And so how do we do that in a React-based UI is still a bit of a question mark. And so there's been a lot of brainstorming going on this week to figure out a way to do that. All right, so these are the 6 steps. A lot of great work, and actually, funny enough, a lot of these steps are very, very useful, not just for an administrative UI. Like JSON API in core is great for building normal decoupled applications for normal visitors, I would say. And the same is true for at least 4 of the 6 steps. So lots of great work going on that will benefit everyone. So really, this is what I talked about. A little bit of the history of JavaScript and Drupal, our API-first initiative about web services, and then also the work that we're doing around the Drupal administration user interface. A lot of people have been helping with this, and I want to highlight a few people here on the slide. I'm sure I'm missing a lot of people too, but it's truly an effort of many people, and I'm very thankful for all of their help. I would love for more people to get involved. I think it's really, really important for Drupal to keep reinventing itself. I think it's a great way to get involved. There's things for people that are relatively new to Drupal, to experts, and it can really, if you think about it, have a big impact, right? The UI is used by, if you think about it, there's 1 million Drupal sites or more, and some of these sites, they have, one user, but others have hundreds or thousands of users. So the impact that this work has on the project and on the people that use the Drupal project can be pretty massive. So even a small change can have a big impact. And so in short, I think we've made a lot of great progress on these things. I feel like we have identified some of these trends well and started moving in the right direction at the right time. I wish we could move even faster. If you have looked at Drupal many, many years ago, and you haven't recently, I would really encourage you to look at it again. It's not the Drupal that it used to be, or that you may have tested and discarded. I think we have a lot of work to do to tell this story. Now that Drupal is really becoming a very respectable API-first platform, we have to tell this story in the JavaScript community, in other communities, right? And so I hope you can help with that. The Drupal Association is also raising some money to help with that and other things, which is a Promote Drupal initiative. And our goal was to raise about $100,000, which we localized to euros. which is why it's kind of a funny number. But we've raised about $73,000, and it's actually enough for us to get started. A lot of people contributed to this, organizations, but also individuals. The Drupal Stichting Nederland, you guys actually contributed $1,000, I think, or 1,000 euros as well, right? So that's awesome. And so we're going to use these funds to hire a marketing coordinator, as well as produce some, assets, marketing assets, to help promote Drupal and some of the things that we're doing. So very excited about these things. And really, that's what I had to say. So thanks for listening. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm not a front-end developer. But yeah, hopefully it was useful. There's a little bit of time for Q&A, I believe. So thank you.
Right, you all suddenly flooded us with questions. We've got some front-end developer questions for you too.
I'll bounce them.
Sorry, we'll start with an easy one. So the most upvoted question is actually about WordPress, and why do you think WordPress has more of the share of the web than Drupal does right now?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think fundamentally WordPress and Drupal target a different user, right? So I mean, WordPress started as a blogging platform, and there's a lot of blogs out there. And Drupal has always been, I think, more feature-rich, more optimized for what I call ambitious websites. Websites that need a little bit more flexibility and configurability. That's historically where Drupal has shined, and I think it's a smaller share of the market. Obviously, things are changing. I think one thing that WordPress does really well is they've made the authoring experience easier. They've also have great, they've automated updates, for example. So they've actually focused a lot on ease of use. And obviously that's something that a lot of smaller websites really care deeply about, because they don't always have the budgets to maybe customize the authoring experience or to pay developers for upgrades. And so Drupal, on the other hand, has always been a little bit more focused on more savvy or more technical people, I would say, as well as maybe organizations with typically larger budgets for maintaining and updating websites. So now we can do a better job, and we actually have multiple initiatives going on to help make Drupal easier to use for content authors and the likes, and also to help make Drupal easier to upgrade. So we're working on these things.
So do you feel like those things that WordPress are pushing forward are also influencing what we need to do in Drupal as well?
That the work that WordPress is doing, that it influences us?
Well, like with content editing and automated updates, are they sort of making us push other things in Drupal too? Yeah,
I think the way, it's actually sort of a beautiful thing, the way we develop things, right? So, Drupal will innovate in certain areas, and then other systems adopt that, right? They look, wow, Drupal is doing this thing really, really well. Like, we have the entity system and views, and people look up to that, and they try to bring that into their projects, and vice versa. We should be looking at what competitors are doing really well as Drupal, right? And so if we can make Drupal easier to use, we should, because it's the right thing to do for our users. And if we can take lessons from WordPress, we should. And similarly, we should be looking at other platforms and see what we can learn from them. So I think it's a very healthy dynamic, and it's what open source is all about, right? We should learn from each other and take these things as input, and then innovate on top of those things. So yeah, absolutely, we should be looking at WordPress and others.
We have a word for like all the other Drupal agencies. We all call each other frenemies. Yeah. Because we're all friends, really. So the next two questions are sort of similar, so I'll ask them together. One was, how do you keep up with the fast front-end changes in JavaScript frameworks? And then the other beneath that is, what happens if React dies out? So I think they're sort of related.
If React dies out. So what was the first part of the question? Sorry.
Well, there's sort of two separate questions, but in
Oh.
the same vein. How do you keep up with fast front-end changes? And then what happens if React
Yeah.
dies out?
It's a good question. I mean, if React dies out, we have to switch to something else. I think a lot of the work that we are doing right now, JSON API, adding web services that are missing, redesigning the experience, coming up with a better look and feel, and a bunch of these other things that I talked about, they have actually nothing to do with React, right? They're like universal things that we have to do. And we could implement them in React, we could implement them in Vue, we could implement them in Angular. And that's probably, I don't want to be careful because I'm not a front-end developer, but I'm going to say it's probably the easier part of some of the things that we're doing. And so, if React dies out for some strange reason, then yeah, I think we would shift to something else, and we would figure out how to do that. We would pull together people to do that and resources to do that, and we would just switch. We're going to have to keep looking at how all of these technologies evolve because they're evolving so quickly. And right now, we feel really good about React. And so we're going to stick with that. If in 5 years' time, there is another new language or technology or framework, then we should really consider switching. And we should do an analysis if it's worth switching or not. But we're always going to keep our eyes and ears open, and we're going to use common sense, I guess, to decide what to do. But right now, React looks like a really good choice,
I think it was its 5th birthday yesterday, from when it was open sourced, so it was good timing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's actually quite a lot of questions asking why Drupal chose React and not something like Vue or Preact or Angular.
Yeah, why React and not the others?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to explain that a little bit. I can sort of repeat some of that, but we looked at the maturity of the project. We felt React had a lot of momentum, has also good commercial backing. A lot of people love React, use React. It has a very rich ecosystem with things like React Native and a lot of great things going for it. We also have to look at the licenses, and that was some licenses are not compatible with Drupal's license, and so we had to look at the legal parts of that. We also have to look at the release schedule, how they do release management, and how they do security, And some other projects, they don't have the same sort of infrastructure, I guess, behind them. Because you have to imagine there's so many Drupal sites, right? And our job is to keep all these sites secure. And so we need to make sure that at any given time, we can ship Drupal with a secure version of whatever JavaScript framework we decide to ship with. And so we need to work with frameworks that have compatible release management processes, right? Because if Drupal's release cycles are 6 years, let's say, we need the framework to be supported for 6 years, which means that whatever we pick, they need to backport security fixes for long enough, because otherwise, we have a problem. And so there's all these things that we have to consider. Frankly, we've also talked to the people that volunteer to do the prototyping, and all the people that we talked to that said, I'm gonna actually invest weeks and months of my time contributing to this initiative. The overall consensus was they wanted to do that in React, right? So that matters too. The people that do the actual work it's a big part of that decision too. And so it was a very careful decision, I would say. We had public conversations about it. We listened to input from the community. At the same time, it was a decision that there's never going to be consensus about. It's like one of these decisions, like you just have to make a choice. Because there's no way everybody's going to say, let's use this, because there's just too many different flavors of frameworks and too many different personal preferences. So We picked one. It's better than not picking one. So.
Great. Might be a little bit of a technical question, but does an API-first approach require only client-side rendering? And if so, how do we ensure we maintain resilience in core functionality?
The question, does it only require client-side rendering? So I think
it does. Yeah, it's a funny question.
Yeah,
because I guess it's easier to make it with client-side rendering,
Yeah.
and so that's probably what everyone does initially.
Yeah. I mean, I want to maybe stress something that I didn't really stress, but I think we need to give our users a flexibility, right? And so if people want to use sort of the traditional Drupal, where Drupal generates all the HTML, people should be able to do that. It's a really valid use case, right? And most people are in that use case. So API first doesn't mean API only. It's a very big difference between API first and API only. So we're saying API first, meaning we want everything to have a good API. And so we want people to use traditional Drupal, and then we want people to use fully decoupled Drupal with or without, isomorphic JavaScript. We call it progressively decoupled, where Drupal does what Twitter does. Maybe Drupal renders the sort of basic page or the page template, and Drupal sends that over, and then a JavaScript framework overlays some of the interaction over that. So, given all of the changes that are happening in the world, in this, the JavaScript world specifically, and given all of the different use cases that Drupal serves, I really believe we kind of need to keep our options open. And so that's what we're doing. So we want to enable people to do all of these things. And you saw a lot of the examples on the slide. I mean, some examples. And they're being built with React, Angular, Vue, Ember. All of these tools are being used with Drupal today. And that's quite exciting. So.
Cool. One last quick question. How did you not lose interest in the project for 18 years? Because that's a long time.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just fun. And I think, there's really, I guess, maybe two driving functions. One, it is fun. I love what I do. I really do. I love working with the people in the Drupal community. I love solving the problems that we're solving. And I love it because it changes. Like, it's not like I've been doing the same thing over and over again, right? 18 years ago, I was writing all of the code. 18 years ago, when I made an API change, I would go update all of the contributed modules to work again. And so my role has evolved quite a bit, from writing a lot of code to doing a lot of code reviews to now helping to oversee initiatives, to working with the Drupal Association on scaling the organization, to making sure initiatives are being funded, and so I don't know. I feel like I'm doing a lot of different things, and that's the variety is fun. I think people lose interest in things or burn out when they do one thing all the time, and it's maybe tedious work, and there is not like a path, there is, and it feels like it's this endless tunnel, right? When there's no change, and so I think variety helps a lot, and I have a lot of variety in what I do. And then the second piece is the impact that we have. Like, I get really, I get my motivation from the impact that we have, the collective impact of Drupal. And, there's maybe 100,000 nonprofits using Drupal, for example, from Amnesty to Greenpeace to, you name it, Doctors Without Borders. And they use Drupal, right? And they use Drupal to better fulfill their mission. Whatever their mission is, I don't even need to know their mission. I know it's a good mission. And if we make Drupal better, we enable these organizations to better fulfill their mission. Like, whether it's better communicating what they are about, whether it's helping them raise more money, so they can do what they want to do, to whatever it is. Like Drupal can really help these organizations have a much bigger impact, right? And to me, that's really, truly rewarding. It's not just nonprofits, it's governments. It's, I mean, all these companies that are trying, or organizations that are trying to do cool things. And I guess that's really what drives me. I don't know, maybe it's a cheeky answer, a cheesy answer, but it's true. So that's why I do what I do. And I think a lot of people feel the same way, at least from my conversations with them. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. So,
you're welcome. Thank you.